Welcome to Linguistically Aware, the podcast about all things linguistics. You are listening to CJSW 90.9 FM, broadcasting out of Calgary, Alberta, at the University of Calgary campus radio station, located on Treaty 7 land. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. My name is Brooklyn Shepard, and I'm a PhD student in linguistics at the University of Calgary. In this conversation-based podcast, I sit down with linguists, or language experts, to talk about the ways language and linguistics interacts with our daily lives. Last time, we had Dr. Lindsay Hracs in here to tell us about her background in linguistics and how it serves her in her job as lead data scientist at the Kaplan Epidemiology Lab at the University of Calgary. Specifically, she told us about one of her lab's recent papers published in Nature on global trends in inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD, where they tracked the stages from 1 to 3 of IBD development in different countries around the world over the past 100 years. In this episode, we continue our conversation with Lindsay on the overlap in linguistics and epidemiology research, as well as how those coming from a humanities background can get into a more data-driven field, like analyzing public health data. Yeah, so I'm wondering, now that you've done this, do you have any plans for what comes next in this sort of, in a similar line of work, or are you sort of shifting gears now to something else?
Yeah, so there's a few things going on. So I mentioned earlier about my thesis model being adopted into one of these forecasting papers. And so one of these, that particular paper is looking at 9 stage 3 countries. So Canada would be considered a stage 3 country. Other examples are Catalonia, United States, New Zealand. So things that, again, like we think of them as Europe, North America, and Oceania is sort of like how we, and so we're working on actually doing some more fine-grained modeling and looking at sort of what to predict in sort of the 10-year short term with their cases. One of the other things we're working on is looking at whether we can use what we're calling societal indicators as a way of predicting inflammatory bowel disease independent of any data on inflammatory bowel disease. So things like the Western Diet Index, which measures calorie intake, calories from certain food types, things like smoking, CO2 emissions, other things like growth, like GDP and those types of things. And we're looking at whether we can actually predict rates of inflammatory bowel disease independent of inflammatory bowel disease by taking these societal indicators and correlating them with countries that have robust data. And we say, like, in Canada in 1970, was a stage two country. And our GDP was X, like smoking looked like this, our Western Diet Index was this. So can we predict stage 2 values from all of these other things? Because it's actually probably much more likely that we're going to have those types of data, whereas to have really good quality data on incidence and prevalence of inflammatory bowel disease requires a lot of things. It requires people to actually be doing the research. It requires people to be able to measure those things. And so one of the qualities of stage 1 countries especially, but stage 2 countries as well, is that their data are just not as robust as stage 3 countries. And so it's a little bit of a strange thing to think about in that we have missing data is very meaningful in this case. And so we're kind of thinking, well, can we predict when a country might be transitioning to a different stage of epidemiology from data that has nothing to do with inflammatory bowel disease. And that's kind of like where our next big push is for this project. We also have a paper that's coming out that was, as I joked about postdoc projects. So Dr. Windsor's postdoc project is he now has a manuscript that's just about ready to go out, where he's looking at the ratio, and I didn't even mention this before. So inflammatory bowel disease, I didn't even define.
that was going to be my next question, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, to talk about inflammatory bowel disease. Like, first of all, do you say IBD? Like as an acronym?
Yeah, so we say IBD.
And I know IBS.
Yeah.
Is there...
So way different...
Totally different?
Entirely different diseases.
There you go.
So I really you can tell I'm not the epidemiologist. I'm the data scientist.
It's all good.
Yeah, inflammatory bowel disease is made up of sort of two diseases, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And it really is, I'm not going to get clinical here because I'm not that type of doctor. But it has to do with inflammation in the bowel. For ulcerative colitis, it's isolated to the bowel. With Crohn's disease, we call it gum to bum. So the inflammation can be really anywhere in your entire digestive tract. So inflammatory bowel disease is made up sort of those two diseases, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Dr. Windsor's been working on a paper for, he hasn't been working on it for 7 years, but it's been, sort of his passion project for 7 years. When he first started as a postdoc, he hypothesized that the ratio of ulcerative colitis to Crohn's disease diagnoses actually changes as countries go through these epidemiologic stages. Mm-hmm. So ulcerative colitis is a lot more easy to diagnose. And oftentimes when someone presents, they will diagnose ulcerative colitis just because, again, it's in sort of the bowel area. So a lot of times the diagnosis is ulcerative colitis until it can be diagnosed as Crohn's disease. And this might be, again, due to infrastructure. It could just be, again, how the disease progresses, that sort of thing. But the hypothesis is that this ratio of ulcerative colitis to Crohn's disease sort of approaches 1 as a country transitions to stage 3. And that's exactly what we ended up finding. So Dr. Windsor's postdoc project, 7 years later, he hasn't been a postdoc for 5 years, but now this paper is going to be coming out, and it's sort of a huge deal as well, because that's sort of where all of this started, was this hypothesis that how these diseases are identified and the rates in which they exist in the population change over time.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. That clears some things up. So I'm wondering, in this paper and on this work, you've done a lot of looking at data, looking at papers too, with a systematic review, like you mentioned. I'm wondering if you noticed any parallels between studying that kind of data, whether it was the papers or the numerical data, and your experience studying language, parallels in terms of the patterns you notice, or how the data behaves, or I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. So I think really a lot of the parallels boil down to both the fun aspects and complex aspects of dealing with human data. One of the things that exists in both linguistic data and public health data is variation. You're always going to be dealing with variation. So in linguists, we look at how, we can look at how things shift across dialects, speakers, and contexts. And in public health, we see a lot of these sort of things where we might see different shifts within different populations. It might have to do with how people report symptoms, or, in linguistics, how when you're giving a judgment, for example, and then you're asked why you're giving that judgment. It's like a self-report, right? So there's a lot of really interesting complexity that's added by just having the fact that you're dealing with human data. And I think one-size-fits-all conclusions really miss a lot of what is interesting about the data. And so that's a really interesting parallel, is like a lot of times you have exceptions, and the exceptions are where the interesting stuff happens. And that's one thing I've found, is that you'll come across something, you'll be doing an analysis, and you'll be like, well, I have this group of outliers, but like there's got to be something interesting happening here. So for example, with our data in particular, with the study that was published in Nature, the Faroe Islands are ridiculously high in ulcerative colitis, more than the rest of the whole world. They are 100% outliers. But if we were to just remove them, we would be removing an entire population of people where there's something extremely interesting happening, right? Whether it's a genetic thing because there's like a, sort of a small group of people there, whether it has something to do with the diet of that particular region. And so, you see a lot of that in linguistics too, where you see outliers, and then you have to ask like, well, why are they outliers, right? And I think that's sort of one of the funnest things for both types of data, is that really it's sort of the strangeness that can be the most interesting part of it.
Yeah, totally. I think that, given like that the study is on such a global scale, it's really easy to see how throwing out like an entire population or an entire country or something is maybe not what we want to do, right? Yeah. But I really like that when you think about it in terms of data, because throwing out outliers is a very common thing that people do in data analysis or data cleaning. But I think maybe this sort of brings us back to why like the humanities or linguistics specifically can be so helpful, because I think sometimes like when you're studying so much data, you forget that data comes from people. Mm-hmm. And those people also matter, especially in a situation like or in a field like public health and epidemiology. So I really like that comment that you made, and it kind of makes me. It kind of brings me to my next question, actually, which is for me, I think one thing that people. So I'll ask you the question first. I'm getting ahead of myself. So my question is, what do you think linguists can bring to fields like data science or epidemiology that others might overlook? And my point in terms of connecting it to the other thing was basically. That I think sometimes having that sort of more humanist sort of perspective in data science, at least from my perspective, because I've worked in more like artificial intelligence kind of field, I think having that more like putting the humans first is something that is often forgotten. But yeah, I'm wondering what you think or what you've experienced that other people have overlooked when you're at a conference and they're like, why are you here?
Yeah, I think we do this thing where we identify the patterns, but then we're like, what does this pattern mean in some context? Right. And I think that's an important thing. So we're trained to, analyze language as sort of this rule-governed thing, right? It's predictable in a lot of ways. But then, kind of we want to ask, like, what does this mean in sort of a context of maybe the human mind, of a speaker group, those sorts of things. And I think that we really... Language is full of ambiguity, variation, and exceptions to the rules, and really public health data is very similar. And I think we want the mindset where when we're looking at data which might be incomplete, which might be culturally variable or inconsistently reported, whether that's, because we're dealing with, health system inconsistencies, or whether we're dealing again with like linguistics where you're dealing with a corpus and you might be looking for something, and if it's not there, we ask it like that might be meaningful and in itself, right? And I think we kind of look at things, we look at the patterns, and then we say, okay, well, that's the pattern. But why is it there? what can we learn about the context of it. And I think that's where linguists sort of have this again, we're trained to sort of look for that, and we bring something to the table that you don't necessarily get when you're just sort of like, pattern analysis and stats and then move on, right? And I think there is that really interesting parallel between linguistics and public health where, okay, we need to, we might be looking at like, okay, well, we're seeing cases of a disease spike here, but we need to know why, right? Like it's really actually important to know why. And I do think that there's, as a linguist, we're sort of like inherently more interested in that question in a lot of times, right? Like the pattern is there, but we want to know kind of the why behind it. And in public health, it's very important also to know the why behind things. And I think, I think we just kind of, again, that's something we're trained on doing very early on, right?
Yeah, totally. You're listening to Linguistically Aware, broadcasting on CJSW 90.9 FM on Treaty 7 Land. Listen to this episode or any other episode of Linguistically Aware in full at cjsw.com or Apple Podcasts. Just search Linguistically Aware. If you'd like to learn more about linguistics at the University of Calgary, be sure to visit our website, calgarylinguistics.ca. Yeah, so, I mean, as someone who has done this move from the world of linguistics to the world of data science and specifically in epidemiology, but I'm wondering if you have any advice for somebody who might be not even necessarily in linguistics, but with a humanities background. It can be specific to linguistics if that's easier, but with a humanities background that's thinking about moving into a more data-driven field, what kinds of advice would you have for them? What was helpful for you, or what do you wish you knew?
Yeah, I think something that I did, again, that was like something I hated doing, but was really a really useful exercise was getting people to do informational interviews. So reaching out and asking people, like, if I were a data scientist, what would I need to have this job? What skills do I have right now that you would find useful? And doing that actually really early on, because the stakes are really low at that point. If you're not looking for a job, then you can kind of say, I'll buy you coffee, I'll buy you lunch, and just let me pick your brain. You work at this company. What would I need to sort of be, on your team? Like what about my skill set would be really useful for you? What about my skill set maybe I need to bolster, those sorts of things. And I think that was something that was really uncomfortable, but was really helpful. And I think it's surprising how people are very receptive to that. I remember one that I did, I was talking about my PhD research, and I was literally drawing syntactic trees on a whiteboard in a boardroom at this like tech company downtown. And they were like, wow, this is like, I never knew this is what linguists actually did, right? And so I think sometimes we can wow them with, really those sorts of things. I think any sort of humanities has their thing that, somebody doesn't know exactly what you do. And I think really like selling that sort of point and being able to teach somebody as much as you're able to learn from somebody. And I think again, networking and practicing selling your transferable skills, which is like, it's awful, but it's really helpful. But I think the more obvious ones are really like, building your coding skills, getting experience with version control, using the command line. And these are all things that you can do to sort of make your own thesis life a little bit easier, even though there's a steep learning curve to start with. And you don't necessarily need to be integrating them into your project. Maybe your project really has nothing to do. You can't, it might actually be hard to figure out where you would put some of these things, right? But maybe like do something to build an easy web scraper to help compile research. Once you get sort of good at it, you could write yourself a very rudimentary document summarizer, right? Or something to organize your PDFs of papers. And so you can kind of look at maybe automating some of the boring stuff that you could, create your own coding projects, let's say. I would say then once you've done those things, post them on a shareable platform so that you have sort of a profile. So something like GitHub or CodeOcean, so people can actually see what you're doing. And again, you don't really need to be, okay, so I'm going to backtrack. You should be using version control. Most of us use, a lot, and everyone's guilty of it all the time. Dates, numbering on, dot, it's like final 1, final 2, final, we do that. But I think like getting experience with using a version control system, because if you go into any job where you're doing something data related, likely there's going to be version control, and they're probably going to want you to be a little bit experienced, even if you haven't used their specific version control, probably some experience with version control. So that you're not just like dating files, you actually can revert your changes. And, and those are things that now I do every day. And I'm so thankful I do, because like when I make a mistake and I break something, it's just like, I'm like, okay, well, it will take me 8 hours to fix this, but it only took me 2 hours to break it. I will just go back the 2 hours and we'll just forget that ever happened. And these are all things, again, that you can do just to sort of like organize your own thesis. Another thing I think that I found really useful was working through the cracking the coding interview. I think Crack the Coding Interview book, where it has a lot of, it's essentially sets you up for those technical interviews, which are awful also. Yes. Like when you're like, I have 24 hours to do this most intense math test I've ever done in my life. And the book will actually kind of like go through some of these logic problems. And a lot of times they just want to be able to see that you can logic your way through something, even if you can't fully code something up, right? And I think all of those things will sort of prepare you a little bit more when you go to actually, if you're wanting to interview in those places. And I think the important thing is not just kind of saying you can do it, but demonstrating you can do it. And that's where it kind of comes down to like posting your things in some sort of shareable place so people can say like, oh yeah, this person actually has scripted up, very rudimentary document summarizer, but they've done it, right? And I think all of that sort of matters. But yeah, it's really just kind of like talking to people and sort of building your skills wherever you can.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of really good advice, especially the one about version control, because I always forget, and then I'm like, oh no. Yeah. Yeah, no, I really liked your point about like if somebody wants to practice coding, but it doesn't necessarily like fit into their research or what they're doing in their program, to do something that like could just automate something helpful, like organizing your PDFs and stuff like that. Because I should really do that. I have like, I'm writing code for all these different things, and yet my desktop is the messiest thing in the entire world. And all of my code is also really messy right now. But no, yeah, I thought that was really nice. I was just going to ask you one more question, if you don't mind. I'm wondering, how long have you been in the working in the epidemiology lab?
I started my postdoc in January of 2022.
Okay, so
3.5. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any. So we've talked a lot about like the parallels and what you bring to linguistics and whatever. I'm wondering if there's anything you miss about linguistics and studying language data specifically, or if you feel like you're getting your data fixed. This is more just like a personal, like, how are you feeling question. Sorry, you don't have to answer it right away, but I'm just curious.
I think sharing office space with a linguist is helpful, because we'll often just be like, we'll pick apart things. And there's this joke now, because there's this desk sort of in between our desks. And it's always been a student desk or a research assistant desk for a limited term, but there's this joke from the other people in the lab that if you sit there, the linguists are going to annoy you and you're going to leave. And so I think like I do get a lot of that, just here and there where we're like, okay, I think like you'll see a weird sentence and you'll be like, what are they doing there? And you'll kind of try to like reconstruct why they wrote this particular thing. I also think that because there is like in research and in science, you are writing. We do get a lot of like, I think especially from Dr. Windsor's side of things, his job is really like science communication and knowledge translation. And so I will write a lot of, I will just sort of stream of conscious write things and then be like, make it into, like, because as a linguist, when we write a paper, it's long. We put we love adverbs. We do. And so I'm like, okay, now we have to put all of these words into a tiny little thing and make it sound good. And make it still like ensure we have the proper meaning, what we're going for. And we have debates all the time where I'm like, you have to leave this sentence because, and he'll like, well, what if I do this? I'm like, but then you're saying this. And so we actually get into like a lot of, I don't want to say heated language debates, but there can get like a little, like there's been times where we've actually diagrammed sentences because we disagree on a point. And so I get like a little bit of that. What I do miss are those things where you have one, you have like maybe one sentence or one utterance or something, and there's a group of you and you're just like, what is going on here? And I miss kind of standing around the whiteboard for hours being like, could it be this? And I think that's something I certainly miss, is that sort of like where you can just get like so obsessed with one tiny little thing. Like, I mean, I studied only. Like I studied one word. I think I have more questions than I have answers at this point. And I do kind of miss being in the weeds of that every day. But I do get some of it. So,
yeah. Nice. Yeah, sorry to just throw that
no,
question
not
at
at
you.
all.
I think about it sometimes because I also do a more sort of data science-y stuff on the side. And yeah, there's just something about language data that it has a special place in my heart also. Even though I also like data, like just sort of generally, and like working with data and figuring out what's going on. And there's something special about language data for me. Yeah.
And I think what it is it really is sort of, as a linguist, you're really kind of interested with what's happening sort of behind the measurable part of language, right? We want to know what's happening in the mind. And there's not a lot of fields where you can get, measurable, observable things and then kind of make hypotheses about what somebody is actually thinking, what processes are happening in their mind. And that's just something that's so very unique to cognitive science, but but with language. And I think like as linguists, I always call it like after school linguistics, where I'm still doing it all the time. Like I will write down it, like somebody says something and we'll write down, I'm like, I'm going to have to think about this sentence later. So I'll just write down the sentence and I'll ponder it later. And I think that that's always going to be who you are, I think, as a linguist. And even if you're not in linguistics proper day to day, you'll still have that.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Well, those are all of my questions I have for you. Thank you so much for coming in here and telling me about this. It's so interesting for me to hear about your sort of journey from linguistics to epidemiology. And just to learn more about everything you're doing and even your PhD research that I know that was a while ago now, but I just want to say thank you so much. This was super, super awesome for me, and I hope our listeners are enjoying it as well.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Linguistically Aware. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the fascinating world of linguistics. If you'd like to learn more about linguistics, please visit our website, calgarylinguistics.ca. Until next time, keep exploring the beauty of language.